Welcome back. Today we aren't talking about an event or person or anything of the sort. Today we're talking about a helicopter. Now, aircraft sometimes have quirks for lack of a better phrase. You might have an entire production run of airframes, but there'll be one that for no discernible reason just happens to be a little special. Take for example Lightning F6 XR 749, a faster than normal English electric Lightning that was the only NATO aircraft to intercept and overtake Concorde from the rear. But today is not about that jet. Today is about a helicopter, a very special helicopter that served for 40 years in multiple war zones, being shot repeatedly but continued to be a delight for those who flew her. Today, we're talking about the RAF Chinook ZA-718, more commonly known as Bravo November, the helicopter that refused to die. Back in 1967, the RAF ordered 15 Chinooks to replace its problematic Belvedere fleet, which had a fuselage life of only 1,600 flying hours. However, in a tradition for the British government, they cancelled the order as a result of defence budget cuts, which definitely still isn't a problem today. Fast forward to 1978, and Britain is slowly climbing out of a recession. The MOD announces its purchase of 33 Chinook helicopters, of which Bravo November would be a part of. The first arrived in 1980, with 18 Squadron becoming the first frontline Chinook squadron. Their first operational outing was at the Falklands War. 5 Chinooks were sent down to the conflict aboard Atlantic Conveyor, alongside 14 Harriers and 6 Wessex helicopters. The first Chinook was offloaded at Ascension Island to help with fleet logistics and supply runs from the airfield, whilst the remaining 4 continued down aboard the Atlantic Conveyor. When she arrived off the Falklands, the Harriers took off and proceeded to the 2 British carriers in the region, Hermes and Invincible, and if you're Argentinian who still claim you sunk HMS Invincible, do one. On the 25th of May 1982, 2 Argentine Super A-10 fighters attacked Atlantic Conveyor with 2 Exocet anti-ship missiles. Because of the amount of fuel and ammunition stored on board, the resulting impact led to an uncontrollable fire which resulted in the loss of all aircraft on board, 6 Wessex helicopters, 1 Lynx helicopter, and 3 Chinook helicopters. 1 Chinook had been spared as she was airborne. Having had her rotors refitted that morning, Bravo November had been conducting an air test and was left as the only heavy lift helicopter for the entire invasion. She was obviously left without being able to return to her original ship, and thus landed aboard the carrier HMS Hermes, much to the chagrin of her captain, who threatened to have Bravo November thrown overboard if she didn't depart again and find somewhere else to land. The loss of all but 1 Chinook severely impacted British invasion plans. What was meant to include the helicopters for swift movement and deployment of troops, specifically towards Stanley, turned the campaign to one of humping it across the island for the Marines and Paras. Bravo November and her crew, which included 4 pilots, 4 aircrew, 27 engineers, and 4 RAF Regiment personnel for force protection, arrived and was stationed out of the San Carlos landing area. The loss of the Atlantic Conveyor presented a major problem for the aircraft, even after she left. Aboard the conveyor was all the manuals, spare parts, specialist tools, equipment, and everything else needed for servicing her, and as such it was unknown how long she was going to be able to remain airworthy. An exercise book would be used as the aircraft's maintenance log. After each day of flying, a note was made of all the defects and problems that would normally have grounded the aircraft, had she not been the only one available. As such, she would be marked safe to fly until receipt of spares for pretty much every occasion. For the first week of the campaign, before the San Carlos breakout, Bravo November would be almost exclusively running logistics, conducting unloading and transporting the goods right to the designated units. Personal weapons, kit, supplies, Rapier SAM systems, Bravo November brought it all across. Prior to the Battle of Goose Green, she was used to prepare for it. She lifted the field guns, shells, ammunition, and any other equipment needed by 2 Power for their assault. During and after the battle, she would conduct casevacs back to the field hospital in Ajax Bay. 2 days later, she was needed by the Marines who were going to take Mount Kent. Prior to the operation, an oil leak was discovered in the gearbox for the rear rotor, and the chief tech was made aware. He gave the crew 2 gallons of oil and told them that if needed, they would have to touch down and refill it themselves, and sign the aircraft off. Upon reflection, he stated that he should not have signed the aircraft as fit to fly. However, she was of vital importance to the Marines' operation, carrying 3 field guns which would have needed 3 separate helicopters to fill Bravo November's gap. And that was before the operation had begun. Once it did begin, it is a miracle she made it back. Upon takeoff, weather conditions were poor, but she pressed on. Upon reaching her landing site for the guns, they discovered the area was a rocky hillside, not a flat landing area. What had been designated as a 5-minute unloading job took 40 minutes, as Bravo November had to manually maneuver each of the guns into firing position. They had also been informed that the landing site was secure. This was untrue, as the entire unloading was conducted whilst under fire. On her return leg, she hit a severe snowstorm, had an altimeter fail, and hit water. She had been slightly nose up at the time of impact and thus had made a belly landing and was floating, though the engines were shutting down owing to water in the intakes since the helicopter landed at about 100 knots. The pilot, Andy Lawless, believing it was a crash, began the evacuation procedure by jettisoning his door, ready to disembark. However, the Chinook's engines recovered and she was able to lift again. One of the crewmen had suffered a concussion from the crash and had to be physically restrained by the other crewman as he tried to exit the aircraft whilst in flight. And I'd love to be able to tell you that this is where everything normalised for Bravo November, but no. In the door the pilot had jettisoned were navigation and IFF squawk codes for the Rapier battery, meaning they couldn't navigate and they could potentially be shot down by their own batteries. Thankfully, the pilot had memorised the route and was able to navigate back, so this just left the surface-to-air missile system. They conducted lame duck manoeuvres, which involved flying straight and level and turning their lights on and off. They were investigated by a Sea King who escorted them back home without further incident. The following day, the aircraft was inspected and despite some minor damage to the ramp and aerials, the aircraft was deemed airworthy. The oil leak was also temporarily fixed. The door, however, could not be replaced, and the pilot, Lawless, described it as bloody cold. She was once again used for an air assault for the Marines in the taking of Fitzroy and Bluff Cove. The officer in charge, Brigadier Wilson, recalls that the crewmaster for Bravo November had said she has a maximum of 33 equipped soldiers after the Marines had told them they needed 60 on board, to which one of the sergeant majors replied, "Well, you can fucking get off for starters," and although might have been a bit rude, got the point across, and all 60 Marines and weapons boarded the Chinook. One of the crewmen, Tom Jones, recalled that as they flew over the Marine artillery position, they nearly shot at her, mistaking it for an Argentine Chinook, until apparently one of the gunners noticed she didn't have her left cockpit door and pointed out it was Bravo November. The loss of the door, although making flights cold, had actually saved the aircraft from being shot down. It should also be noted that 60 was not the maximum number of equipped soldiers she took on board at once. She did one flight of 71 and one flight of 81. Not too bad considering the maximum was supposed to be 33 and at a push 41. The following day, Arthur Sir Galahad and Sir Tristram were both here in Argentine air raids, and Bravo November was tasked with carrying the wounded to the field hospital at Ajax Bay or to a hospital ship. This was the last major action of the war, although she remained flying throughout the rest of the conflict, ferrying troops and equipment. A second Chinook arrived to the Falklands to assist Bravo November, 2 hours after the Argentine surrender on the 14th of June 1982. Following the surrender, the ground crew of Bravo November nicked the door of a captured Argentinian Chinook to replace the one that had been jettisoned, which she continued to fly with for many years after the fact. All in all, her first combat outing had seen her fly 17 out of the 18 days she was ashore. She had ferried over 2,000 troops, 95 casualties, 550 prisoners of war, and 550 tons of equipment, the same amount as carried by an entire Sea King squadron for the same period of time. She had done this whilst being shot, crashed, losing pieces, and without any spares or tools to keep her airborne. The fact that she was able to play such a pivotal role is a testament to herself and to the ground crew's ability to keep her flying with duct tape and broken dreams. She had also had the first of her pilots, Squadron Leader Dick Langworthy, awarded the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions at Mount Kent. She saw limited service in Lebanon and Northern Ireland before her next big outing in 2003. Bravo November was part of the coalition's invasion of Iraq in 2003 and was the first British helicopter to land the Royal Marines, who were charged with taking the Al-4 Peninsula oil facilities before the Iraqis could destroy them. On the 20th of March 2003, at 2200 hours, 5 Chinooks took off from HMS Ark Royal and headed towards the peninsula, with Bravo November leading the flight. At an altitude of only 100 feet, the Chinooks had a tough time. Visibility was hampered by fires and dust storms kicked up by US troop movements. Visibility was so bad that the Chinooks had to be guided by an orbiting AC-130 gunship. Despite this, Bravo November and her flight successfully landed 40 Commando at the insertion points before returning to bring in supplies and ammunition, whilst other Chinooks and Pumas brought in 42 Commando to reinforce. The battle raged for 4 days, with it finally concluding on the 24th of March. All throughout that time, the Chinooks had been used for ferrying men and equipment to support the operation, and by the end, the peninsula and oil fields were under coalition control. The adverse weather and the required skill to pilot the lead aircraft to the insertion points of 40 Commando, whilst under fire, earned Bravo November pilot Steve Carr the Distinguished Flying Cross, the second for this airframe. Bravo November would be deployed to Afghanistan in 2006 to help with operations there, which was to see one of her pilots receive the 3rd DFC aboard her. On the 11th of June 2006, Flight Lieutenant Craig Wilson was on call with Bravo November when they received a CASEVAC request. Despite having to remain below 150 feet in altitude, the casualty was successfully evacuated back to Camp Bastion. He was then called out again in support of British operations. He returned, and upon landing, despite being low on fuel and having been on duty for around 22 hours at that stage, Wilson flew back to the battlefield with reinforcements for the ground element, landing under fire and then returning back to Bastion with a further 2 wounded personnel. For this action on the 11th of June, Flight Lieutenant Craig Wilson would be awarded the 3rd Distinguished Flying Cross for the airframe. Bravo November's last noteworthy excursion occurred again in Afghanistan, but this time in 2010. However, what makes this incident different is that there was a camera crew on board to film. A Discovery crew was on board filming a section for frontline battle machines when the Chinook was called out to evacuate wounded US Marines. Taking fire on the way in and out, the Chinook successfully extracts the wounded soldiers. However, as she's lifting off and leaving the battlefield, Bravo November takes multiple rounds to the airframe, suffering damage to the fuel tanks, hydraulic lines, and 1 round went through the front windshield and struck the pilot, Ian Fortune, in the head. Despite not knowing the extent of his injury and only knowing he was bleeding, he calmly and professionally flew the stricken Chinook back to Bastion. The hydraulic line damage had made the Chinook more sluggish. They had a full complement of soldiers and medics on board, and Fortune was beginning to feel pain from being shot in the head. Despite all this, he landed the aircraft safely at Camp Bastion, where the casualties and himself received medical treatment. Luckily, Fortune had not received any serious injury, and for his calmness, professionalism, and skill in flying Bravo November back to base, he was awarded the 4th DFC aboard this lucky Chinook. In an interview later, Fortune would go on to say, "When you're flying it, although it's like flying any of the other airframes we have, there is just a little something there, a little bit of extra magic from time to time." I would say that is the perfect way to sum up Bravo November. Just like all the other Chinooks, but every so often she makes it known you're in good hands. She was retired from service in 2022 and now lives in the museum at RAF Cosford. Over her 41 years of service, she saved countless lives, had 4 pilots receive the Distinguished Flying Cross, which, if you're American, is equivalent to the Silver Star, helped with flood prevention, and was a joy to her crews who remember her with an almost spiritual fondness. Despite numerous battles and war zones she endured, Bravo November remained the helicopter that refused to die. Thanks for watching as we cover this legendary aircraft. If you enjoyed the video, then please like and subscribe to the channel and comment what you want me to cover the next time. Until then.